I'm Audrey Mitchell, 28, and I never thought I'd come home from a business trip to find my entire life sitting in trash bags on the curb. My mother Linda stood behind our front window, cold eyes watching as I tried my key in a lock that no longer fit. "You don't live here anymore," she said through the barely opened door. This was the house my father left when he died 5 years ago, where I'd been paying bills while building my career. Little did my mother know, my father had left me more than just memories. Before I dive into this wild story, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand up for yourself against your own family. Trust me, you're going to want to see how I legally claimed what was rightfully mine. The relationship between my mother and me had always been complicated at best, toxic at worst. Growing up, nothing I did was ever good enough for her. My father, Richard, was the buffer between us, the peacemaker who somehow managed to keep our family functioning despite the constant tension. He had this gentle way of diffusing my mother's criticism while building me up, helping me believe in myself despite her constant disapproval. When Dad died of a sudden heart attack 5 years ago, the foundation of our family crumbled. I was 23, just starting my career at an architectural firm, and completely devastated. My father had been my biggest supporter, the one who encouraged my dreams when my mother only saw them as unrealistic fantasies. "You're just like your father, head in the clouds," she would say, making it sound like an insult rather than the compliment I took it to be. After the funeral, Mom and I continued living together in the family home not because we wanted to, but because Dad had made us both promise to take care of each other. His last wish was for his family to remain close, to support each other through the grief. I stayed despite every instinct telling me to run, wanting to honor his memory and fulfill that final promise. For the first few years, we existed in a delicate balance of avoidance and forced politeness. I worked long hours at the firm, climbing the ranks from junior designer to project manager. My mother continued teaching elementary school, coming home to grade papers in silence at the kitchen table. We were like two planets orbiting the same sun, never colliding but never truly connecting either. Things began to shift when I received a major promotion at work. Suddenly, I was leading my own team, designing sustainable community centers that were getting attention in industry publications. My success seemed to trigger something in my mother, a jealousy or resentment that I couldn't quite understand. "I guess you think you're something special now," she said over dinner one night, after I'd excitedly shared news about a design award. "Your father was always chasing recognition too. Look where that got him." The comment stung like a slap. My father had been an architect too, though his career had been hampered by the recession and the need to provide stability for our family. He'd sacrificed his bigger dreams to ensure we were taken care of. To hear her dismiss his life's work and by extension, mine was devastating. Our arguments about the house intensified too. Since Dad died, I'd taken over most of the bills: mortgage, utilities, property taxes, while my mother contributed minimally. I had also invested in updating the aging kitchen, replacing the leaking roof, and maintaining the yard my father had loved so much. I saw it as honoring his memory, keeping his beloved home in good condition. My mother saw it as me trying to take over. The real breaking point came the night before I left for a business trip to Chicago. I came home to find a strange man in our living room, feet propped up on the coffee table my father had handcrafted. "Audrey, this is Walter," my mother announced, a defiant glint in her eye. "He's moving in this weekend." I was stunned. In the 5 years since my father's death, my mother had dated occasionally, but she'd never brought anyone home, let alone suggested they move in. Walter was at least a decade younger than her, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Something about him set off immediate alarm bells. "Don't you think we should have discussed this first?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "This is a big decision." "I don't need your permission," my mother snapped. "This is my house." "It's our house," I corrected her. "Dad left it to both of us, and I've been paying the majority of expenses for years." Walter shifted uncomfortably, then leaned forward with an oily smile. "Linda mentioned there might be some resistance." "Listen, sweetie, your mom deserves happiness after all this time alone. Don't you think it's time you found your own place anyway, a successful career woman like yourself?" The condescension in his tone made my skin crawl. I turned to my mother. "Can we discuss this privately?" "There's nothing to discuss," she replied. Walter's moving in. If you don't like it, maybe it is time you found your own place. I couldn't sleep that night, troubled by Walter's presence and my mother's ultimatum. Something felt wrong beyond the obvious disruption. When I checked our mail the next morning before leaving for the airport, I noticed several official-looking letters addressed to my mother from Dad's attorney mail I had never seen before. What I didn't know then was that my mother had been planning my eviction for months. Walter, who'd only been dating my mother for a few months, had convinced her that I was taking advantage of her, that I saw the house as my inheritance rather than hers. He had helped change the locks while I was away on my 3-day business trip, gleefully participating in what would be just the first betrayal. When I returned from Chicago, exhausted from presenting designs to clients and ready to collapse in my own bed, I found my key wouldn't work. After several attempts, my mother appeared at the window, watching me struggle without making a move to help. When she finally cracked the door open, her words were like ice. "You don't live here anymore, Audrey. It's time you stood on your own 2 feet." I stood there in shock, my suitcase still beside me. "What are you talking about? All my things are inside. I paid the mortgage last week." "Your things are there," she said, gesturing to the curb where black garbage bags were piled. Some had already split open from the weight, my clothes spilling onto the damp ground. "Take them and go." The humiliation burned as neighbors peeked from windows and slowed their cars driving by. Mrs. Keller from next door was watering her plants, pretending not to watch but clearly taking in every detail of my public shaming. I moved toward the bags, hands shaking as I tried to gather what I could. My laptop was missing, along with the jewelry box that contained my grandmother's pearl earrings and the watch my father had given me for college graduation. When I turned to ask about them, my mother had already closed the door. As I frantically searched through the rain-dampened trash bags, I realized something even worse was missing: all the photographs of my father and me, the albums I had carefully preserved, the framed picture from our last fishing trip together that had sat on my nightstand. These weren't just possessions, they were my connections to him, tangible reminders of his love. "Audrey?" A voice called from across the street. It was Jessica Liu, a neighbor who had moved in a year ago. We weren't close, but we'd chatted at community events. "Are you okay?" "What's happening?" I couldn't even form words as tears streamed down my face, my hands still buried in a garbage bag of hastily packed clothes. Jessica crossed the street and put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Let me help you get these to my place. You can figure out next steps when you're inside." I nodded mutely, overwhelmed by this small kindness from a virtual stranger when my own mother had just thrown me away like garbage. As we carried the bags to Jessica's garage, she asked careful questions, piecing together what had happened. When I mentioned the house had been my father's, her expression changed. "Did your father leave a will? Who actually owns the house now?" The question stopped me short. In the fog of grief after Dad's death, I had never seen the final paperwork. My mother had handled the legal details, and I had trusted her, a mistake I was only now beginning to understand the magnitude of. "I'm not sure," I admitted. I thought we both did." Jessica nodded thoughtfully. "I think you might want to check on that. My brother's a real estate attorney. I can give you his number if you want." As I collapsed on Jessica's couch that night, surrounded by trash bags of my hastily packed life, I couldn't stop thinking about those unopened letters from my father's attorney. What had my mother been hiding from me all this time? Jessica's spare room became my temporary sanctuary. The walls were bare, the mattress thin, but it was a safe place to fall apart, which I did, frequently. I would wake up in the middle of the night, momentarily forgetting what had happened until reality crashed back in. Then the tears would come again, soaking the borrowed pillowcase as I muffled my sobs. "I don't want to bother Jessica," I kept telling myself, though she assured me repeatedly that I wasn't. During the day, I maintained a facade of functionality at work. I led meetings, reviewed blueprints, and nodded at appropriate times, but inside I was crumbling. My colleagues noticed the change but attributed it to stress from the Chicago project. Only my assistant Rebecca knew the truth, after finding me crying in the storage closet during lunch. "You're homeless but you're still showing up to work?" she had asked incredulously. "Audrey, you need to take some time." "And do what?" I'd responded. "Sit around and think about how my mother threw me out like yesterday's trash?" At least here I can pretend things are normal for 8 hours. The nightmares were the worst part, dreams where I was searching for my father through our old house, hearing his voice but never finding him. In these dreams, he was always disappointed in me, asking why I had let this happen, why I hadn't protected the home he loved. I'd wake up gasping, my heart racing, feeling like I had failed him all over again. While I was struggling to process the betrayal, my mother was escalating her cruelty. The morning after my eviction, she had sent a text message that still made my stomach turn whenever I thought about it. "You've been taking advantage of me for years. It's time you grew up and stopped living off your dead father's name. Don't come back here making a scene." When I didn't respond, the text continued, each more hurtful than the last. She accused me of stealing from her over the years, of trying to push her out of her own home, of dishonoring my father's memory by being selfish. The gaslighting was so extreme that I actually began questioning my own memories and motives. Had I been unfair to her? Was I the villain in her story? I tried calling her to request my missing personal documents, my birth certificate, social security card, passport, but she refused to answer. When I finally got through using Rebecca's phone, she hung up as soon as she heard my voice. Then came the truly devastating blow. Jessica's neighbor Martha called to tell her that my mother was hosting a family gathering. Aunts, uncles, cousins I hadn't seen in months were all arriving with casserole dishes and wine bottles. I hadn't been invited, obviously, but the knowledge that life was continuing celebrating, even without me, was like a physical pain. Later that week, my Aunt Diane called. I answered eagerly, hoping for an ally, someone who might help mediate the situation. "How could you abandon your mother like this?" were her first words. My breath caught in my throat. "What?" "Linda told us everything, how you moved out without notice, how you've been refusing to help with the house expenses, how you threatened to sue her over Richard's life insurance. After everything she's done for you." The lies were so outrageous that I couldn't even formulate a response. By the time I gathered my thoughts to explain, Aunt Diane had already launched into a lecture about family loyalty and honoring my father's memory. When I finally managed to interject with the truth, she dismissed it as my side of the story and suggested I needed therapy to deal with my father issues. Within days, I discovered I'd been blocked on social media by most of my extended family. Photos appeared of a family dinner I hadn't known about, comments expressing support for my mother in her difficult time dealing with Audrey's issues. My cousin Taylor, once my closest confidant, sent a message saying she was disappointed in me and needed space from our friendship. The isolation was overwhelming. The family I had grown up with, the people who should have known me best, had accepted my mother's fiction without question. Not one of them had reached out to hear my side before passing judgment. In a desperate attempt to resolve things, I decided to confront my mother directly. I knew her schedule. She would be leaving the elementary school around 4 p.m. I waited in the parking lot, rehearsing a calm, reasonable approach. When she emerged from the building, I stepped forward. "Mom, please, we need to talk." Her face hardened at the sight of me. "I have nothing to say to you. I just want my documents and my father's photos. That's all. You can keep everything else." Instead of responding, she turned to a group of fellow teachers nearby. "This is what I was telling you about," she announced loudly. "My daughter has been harassing me since her father died. Now she's showing up at my workplace." The teachers looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. One put her arm around my mother protectively. "Should we call security?" another asked. "Mom, please," I said, my voice cracking. "Don't do this." But she was already playing the victim to perfection, dabbing at non-existent tears while describing how worried she was about my mental state and how she feared for her safety. The performance was so convincing that within minutes, a security guard was escorting me off the property, warning me about trespassing laws while my mother watched from behind her protective circle of colleagues. I sat in my car afterward, shaking so badly I couldn't insert the key into the ignition. The public humiliation was complete. In the span of a week, I had lost my home, my family, and now my dignity. My mother had not only pushed me out of her life, but was actively working to destroy my reputation and relationships. As I finally managed to start the car, I caught a glimpse of Walter in the school parking lot, arriving to pick up my mother. He put his arm around her shoulders, but what struck me was how his eyes followed me, calculating, almost triumphant. This wasn't just my mother's vendetta. something else was happening, and Walter was at the center of it. That evening, Jessica came home with unexpected news. She had spotted Walter at First National Bank downtown during her lunch break. "He was with your mother," she said carefully. "They were meeting with the mortgage department. I only noticed because he was being so loud about how they were finally going to enjoy their retirement." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. My mother is 58. She's not retiring anytime soon. Jessica hesitated. "There's something else. My friend Tina works at Golden Years Realty. They specialize in retirement properties in Arizona." She mentioned a Linda Mitchell touring condos last month. The pieces were starting to connect in a troubling pattern. "So they're planning to sell the house," I said slowly. "My father's house." "There's more," Jessica said, her expression grim. I did some digging. Walter Hammond has quite the reputation locally. He's dated 3 other widows in the past 5 years. All of them ended up selling their homes shortly after he moved in. One filed a police report afterward claiming financial abuse, but dropped it suddenly. The predatory pattern was clear, but what baffled me was my mother's willingness to be manipulated. She'd always been sharp, cynical even. How had this man so completely won her over against her own daughter? My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was my cousin Rachel. "I just found out what Aunt Linda is telling everyone. It doesn't sound like you. Call me." At least one person was questioning the narrative. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold onto a tiny crack in the wall of isolation my mother had built around me. The morning after learning about Walter's visit to the bank, I called Brian Wells, a law school friend who had helped with some contracts at work. I hadn't wanted to escalate the situation. Legally suing my own mother felt like crossing a line I couldn't come back from, but Walter's involvement changed things. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was potentially elder exploitation, with my mother as both victim and accomplice. "I need to understand where I legally stand with the house," I explained after giving him a condensed version of events. "I've been paying most of the mortgage and bills for years, but I'm not sure what my father's will actually specified." Brian's office was in a converted Victorian downtown, all polished wood and leather-bound books, a stark contrast to the chaos I felt inside. As I sat across from his desk, fidgeting with my coffee cup, he asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you have a copy of your father's will?" I shook my head. My mother handled all of that. I was a mess after he died. She said he left everything to both of us, but now I'm not sure. Brian's expression turned thoughtful. "Let's start with the county records. Real estate transactions and probate filings are public record." What we discovered over the next hour made my coffee go cold in its cup. My father's will had never been properly executed through probate court. There was a draft on file with his attorney. Brian had reached out to the firm, but the final version had never been submitted to the court. "This is actually significant," Brian said, studying the property records on his computer. "Without a will going through probate, inheritance defaults to state intestacy laws. Your father's assets would be divided between his spouse and children." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked, trying to process the legal terminology through my emotional fog. "It means," Brian said, looking up with a hint of a smile, "that you likely own 50% of that house through inheritance. Your mother can't legally sell it without your consent, and she certainly can't evict you from property you co-own." The revelation hit me like a physical force. For 5 years, I had been operating under the assumption that I was living in my mother's house out of her goodwill, when in fact, I was a legal co-owner. All those mortgage payments, property taxes, and utility bills I'd been paying weren't charity, they were investments in my own property. "There's something else," I said, pulling out my phone to show Brian the photo I'd taken of the pile of mail by the door before I left for Chicago. Among the catalogs and bills was an envelope with the letterhead of my father's attorney. "I think my mother has been hiding correspondence from my father's lawyer. These were never opened." Brian's expression hardened. "That's mail tampering. It's a federal offense." Over the next few days, we began gathering evidence to establish my legal claim to the property. I collected years of bank statements showing mortgage payments from my account, utility bills in my name, and receipts for home improvements I'd funded: a new roof, kitchen renovation, bathroom updates. All told, I had invested over $80,000 in maintaining and improving the property since my father died. Meanwhile, Jessica's brother, who worked in real estate law, helped Brian access property tax records and the history of the deed. The evidence was clear. The house had never been properly transferred solely to my mother's name after my father's death. I was, legally speaking, a 50% owner through inheritance. While we were building my case, Brian's investigator uncovered disturbing information about Walter Hammond. He had been charged with fraud in Nevada 3 years earlier, charges that were mysteriously dropped when the victim refused to testify. He had a pattern of moving in with recently widowed women, isolating them from family, and convincing them to liquidate assets before disappearing. Most troubling of all, he had filed for bankruptcy just 6 months before meeting my mother, listing over $200,000 in gambling debts. His sudden interest in my mother's finances made perfect predatory sense. "I think they're planning to sell quickly," Brian said during our third meeting. "The bank records show your mother took out a home equity line of credit last month, something she couldn't legally do without your signature as co-owner, but she might have forged that." "How would she get away with that?" I asked. "Small banks sometimes get sloppy with verification, especially with longtime customers. They might have just taken her word that she was the sole owner." The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Jessica had been collecting my mother's mail that had mistakenly been delivered to her house, mostly catalogs and credit card offers. Among them was a brochure for Golden Sunset Villas in Arizona, with a handwritten note confirming an appointment with a realtor on the 15th. Inside was a printed email with my mother and Walter's names, discussing liquidating the Michigan property as soon as possible and fresh start funds. They were planning to sell my childhood home, my legal property, and disappear to Arizona with the money. The revelation should have galvanized me into action, but instead, I found myself spiraling into doubt. Fighting my mother through the courts would mean publicly declaring war on my only living parent. The family damage would be irreparable. For a moment, I considered simply walking away, letting her and Walter have the house and whatever they could get for it. "I don't know if I can do this," I confessed to Brian during a late evening call. "What would my father think of me taking my mother to court?" "What would your father think about his wife throwing his daughter out on the street and trying to steal her inheritance?" Brian countered gently. "From everything you've told me, he was a man who believed in fairness and protecting his family. That includes protecting you, even from your mother's poor decisions." I spent that night sitting on Jessica's back porch, looking at the stars and imagining conversations with my father. Would he be ashamed of the family conflict, or would he understand I was fighting for what he had wanted me to have? The house had been his pride, the place he designed additions for, planted trees he wouldn't live to see mature, created a home for the family he loved. The thought of Walter profiting from my father's life's work made something harden inside me. By morning, my resolve had solidified. I would not allow my mother and her predatory boyfriend to steal what was legally mine, what my father had intended for me to have. I called Brian. "I want to move forward," I said. "What's our next step?" The day after I decided to fight for my inheritance, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. "Audrey? It's Tom Collins, your dad's old friend from the firm." My breath caught. Tom had been my father's best friend and business partner at the architectural firm where they'd worked together for 15 years. After Dad died, Tom had tried to stay in touch, but my mother had always made those interactions awkward, and eventually, the calls and visits had stopped. "Tom," I said, relief washing over me at the sound of a friendly voice. "How did you find me?" "Your mother's been telling some stories," he said carefully. "They didn't sound right to me. I tried calling the house, but she hung up when I asked about you. I finally tracked down your work number." We agreed to meet for coffee that afternoon. Tom looked older than I remembered, his hair now completely gray, but his kind eyes were the same. He'd been like an uncle to me growing up, taking me fishing when Dad was too busy, attending my school plays and graduations. "Your father would be heartbroken about what's happening," he said after I explained the situation. "He always worried about your mother's relationship with money. She resented how careful he was with their finances." Tom revealed things I hadn't known: how my mother had maxed out credit cards behind my father's back, how she'd pressured him to take out a second mortgage to fund vacations and luxury purchases. My father had always been the financial anchor, the one who insisted on building security before spending on wants rather than needs. "Your dad set up trusts for your college that your mother couldn't touch," Tom explained. "She was furious about it, but he was determined you would graduate debt-free. Most importantly, Tom confirmed what I'd suspected. Richard absolutely intended for you to have half that house." We talked about it when he was updating his will. He was explicit that you and your mother should both have security. Having Tom's support gave me renewed strength. He wasn't just a link to my father, he was a witness to my father's intentions, someone who could counter my mother's narrative about me being selfish or entitled. With Brian's legal guidance, we formulated a three-part strategy. First, we would file for a partition action, a legal process that would force the sale of the property and division of proceeds between co-owners. This would prevent my mother from selling without my involvement. Second, we would document all improvements and payments I had made to establish my equitable contribution beyond the inherited 50% legal ownership. Third, we would gather witness statements about my residence and role in maintaining the property to counter any claims that I had abandoned my rights. While the legal machinery slowly began to move, my mother's response was swift and vicious. The night after we filed the initial partition papers, my phone exploded with calls from her number. When I finally answered, her voice was nearly unrecognizable with rage. "How dare you?" she hissed. "After everything I've done for you, you're trying to steal my home? Your father would be disgusted." "Mom, I just want what Dad intended for me to have. Half the house is legally mine." "Nothing is yours," she screamed. "You've been taking advantage of me for years. Walter was right about you." The mention of Walter confirmed my suspicions about his influence. Before I could respond, she continued, her voice suddenly cold and controlled. "If you go through with this, you're dead to me. Do you understand? You will never be welcome in this family again." The threat would have devastated me a few weeks earlier, but now it just strengthened my resolve. "I think you made that clear when you put my things in trash bags," I replied, surprising myself with my steadiness. She hung up, but the harassment continued. Late-night calls from blocked numbers, an attempt to break into Jessica's apartment building that the security camera captured as Walter, a confrontation outside my office where he approached me in the parking lot, all smiles and reasonable tones for witnesses, while muttering threats under his breath. "Your mother's heart condition won't handle the stress of a court battle," he said, though I had never known my mother to have any heart issues. "Think carefully about whether you want her death on your conscience." I reported these incidents to Brian, who helped me file for a restraining order against Walter. Meanwhile, evidence of his manipulation of my mother mounted. Jessica's friend at the bank had overheard them discussing changes to my mother's will, changes that would benefit Walter in case of her unexpected passing. Tom introduced me to another architect from the firm who had recently done work on the house. He reported that my mother had been draining accounts to pay for expensive renovations. Walter insisted were necessary granite countertops, custom cabinetry, a hot tub on the back deck. All improvements that would increase the home's value before selling. Most concerning were reports from neighbors about my mother's declining appearance. Mrs. Keller mentioned she seemed constantly exhausted and had lost weight. Another neighbor had heard arguments late at night, with Walter's voice dominating. I was caught in a terrible bind fighting my mother legally while worrying about her welfare. Was she truly Walter's victim, manipulated and isolated until she turned against her own daughter? Or was she a willing participant, finally showing her true feelings toward me after years of my father's moderating influence? The legal process was expensive and draining. By the second month of proceedings, my savings were nearly depleted from legal fees and the cost of temporary accommodations. Brian had taken my case on a partial contingency basis, but court filings, expert assessments, and other expenses were mounting. One particularly bad night, after receiving notice that my mother's attorney was filing delay tactics, I nearly gave up. I sat in Jessica's spare room, surrounded by the few possessions I'd salvaged, and wrote an email to Brian suggesting we drop everything. Let my mother have the house. Let Walter win. I was too exhausted to keep fighting. My finger hovered over the send button when Jessica knocked, holding a battered cardboard box. "This came for you," she said. From Tom Collins. Inside was a collection of my father's old books' architecture texts, mostly, that Tom had kept after clearing out my father's office. A note explained that he thought I might want them, given my own career path. As I leafed through the pages, a sealed envelope fell out from between two books. It was addressed to me in my father's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers I opened it. The letter was dated 3 months before his death. "My dearest Audrey, *, if you're reading this, something has happened to me, and Tom has given you my books as we once discussed. There are things I need you to know, things I've been trying to find the right time to tell you in person. Asterisk. Asterisk, I've become increasingly concerned about your mother's financial decisions. She resents the boundaries I've set on our spending, and I worry about what will happen to our financial security and yours if I'm not here to manage things. Asterisk. Asterisk. I've updated my will to ensure you'll always have a home. No matter what, half of our house belongs to you. It's not just about the property value, it's about knowing you'll always have a place that's yours, a foundation to build your future on. Asterisk. Asterisk. Your mother may not understand this decision, she may even resent it. But I need you to stand firm. Don't let guilt or manipulation cause you to give away what I've worked to provide for you. Asterisk. Asterisk. You've always been stronger than you know, Audrey. Your kindness isn't weakness, but don't let it become an excuse for others to take advantage of you, even family. Asterisk. Asterisk. All my love. Asterisk. Asterisk. Dad. Asterisk. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face. It wasn't just the legal validation of my claim to the house, it was my father reaching across time to give me permission to stand up for myself, to fight for what he had intended for me to have. I deleted the draft email to Brian and instead sent him a new one. I found new evidence. Let's move forward, whatever it takes. The first real court hearing came nearly 3 months after my eviction. The judge was a stern-looking woman in her 60s who studied the paperwork with narrowed eyes as Brian presented our case. My mother sat across the aisle with Walter beside her, both dressed formally and projecting an image of dignified victimhood. Her attorney painted me as an entitled millennial who had taken advantage of my widowed mother's generosity, then turned on her when asked to finally support myself. The performance was convincing. I could see several people in the courtroom nodding along, including the court clerk. When Brian presented the evidence of my co-ownership and financial contributions, however, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the bank statements showing my mortgage payments for 5 years, the receipts for the new roof, HVAC system, and other major improvements, tax records with my signature, neighbors' affidavits confirming I had been the one maintaining the property while living there. Most damning was the evidence that my mother had attempted to refinance the house solely in her name despite my legal co-ownership, something the judge noted with visible disapproval. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, addressing my mother directly, "are you aware that attempting to encumber jointly owned property without all owners' consent is potentially fraudulent?" My mother's face flushed. "I was told the house was mine after my husband's death." "And who told you that?" the judge asked. My mother glanced at Walter, who stared straight ahead, expression carefully neutral. The judge's ruling was clear. The property was indeed jointly owned, with each of us having a 50% interest. She issued a temporary order preventing any sale or additional encumbrance of the property until the case was fully resolved. Most importantly, she acknowledged my right to access the property as a legal co-owner. "Miss Mitchell cannot be barred from entry to her own property," she stated firmly. "If personal conflicts make cohabitation impossible, the court recommends the parties work toward a fair division or sale of the asset." As we left the courtroom, I caught sight of my mother and Walter in an intense conversation near the water fountain. Though I couldn't hear the words, his expression was thunderous, his finger jabbing toward her as she shrank back against the wall. For the first time, I witnessed a crack in his solicitous partner facade. Jessica, who had come for moral support, noticed too. "That doesn't look like a man congratulating his girlfriend on fighting for her rights," she observed quietly. Over the next few weeks, the family dynamic continued to shift. My cousin Rachel called to say she'd attended the hearing and had serious questions about the story my mother had been telling everyone. "She made it sound like you were trying to steal her home," Rachel said. "But the judge said you've been paying the mortgage, and Mom said Aunt Linda told her you moved out voluntarily?" As Rachel began sharing her doubts with other family members, small cracks appeared in the united front against me. My Uncle Steve called to apologetically ask for my side of the story. My mother's sister Diane still wouldn't speak to me directly but had apparently questioned my mother about the refinancing attempt. The most significant development came through Brian's investigator. 2 women had contacted his office after seeing a notice he had placed in the legal section of the newspaper regarding Walter Hammond. Both had dated Walter in the past 2 years. Both described the same pattern: Charm followed by isolation, pressure to change financial arrangements, then verbal abuse when they resisted. He convinced me to add him to my bank accounts, in case something happened to me, one woman explained. 3 weeks later, $42,000 disappeared. When I confronted him, he became terrifying, threatened to tell everyone I was mentally unstable, that no one would believe me. The local news picked up the story, running a segment on financial abuse of older adults that featured Walter's pattern without naming him directly. Still, anyone who knew him would recognize the description. My mother must have seen it too, because the next day she was admitted to Riverside Hospital with chest pains and elevated blood pressure. Despite everything, I rushed to the emergency room as soon as Jessica told me, sick with worry that the stress had actually damaged her heart. The emergency room doctor assured me it was not a heart attack, but stress-induced hypertension that needed monitoring. When I finally worked up the courage to enter her hospital room, my mother was propped up on pillows, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. "You're in the hospital, Mom." "Of course I came." She looked away. "Walter said you'd be celebrating." I bit back a retort. "Is he here?" "He went to get my things from home. I might be here overnight." We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. I noticed the hospital had listed me as her emergency contact, not Walter, and wondered if that had been her choice or hospital protocol. "The doctor says it's stress," she finally said. "He says I need to remove stressors from my life." I half expected her to identify me as the stressor, but she just stared at the IV in her arm. "Mom," I said carefully, "I need to ask you something. Did Walter tell you to change the locks while I was gone? Was that his idea?" Her eyes darted to mine, then away. "It doesn't matter whose idea it was. It needed to be done. You're 28. It's time you stood on your own." I have been standing on my own. I've been paying the majority of the expenses for that house for 5 years. She had no response to that, just pressed her lips together and changed the subject. "I need to rest now." When I returned to the hospital the next morning, I learned Walter had been there late last night and had left with my mother's purse and car keys. He hadn't returned. The nurse mentioned my mother had seemed upset after his visit, had asked to call him several times with no answer. By evening, the pattern was clear. Walter had disappeared. 3 days later, my mother discovered her jewelry was missing, along with her credit cards and the car itself. When I gently suggested filing a police report, she refused. "It's a misunderstanding," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "He's coming back." He didn't. The car was found a week later in the long-term parking lot at Detroit Metropolitan Airport. Security footage showed Walter boarding a flight to Las Vegas. By then, my mother had discovered he had maxed out her credit cards, taking cash advances of nearly $30,000. The family narrative had completely reversed. Now I was the dutiful daughter helping my poor mother who had been victimized by a predator. The very relatives who had blocked me on social media were now sending supportive messages, praising my patience and forgiveness. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt hollow. My relationship with my mother was still fundamentally broken, my place in my family still conditional on fitting their preferred narrative. And Walter's disappearance hadn't resolved the central issue. What would happen to the house we both legally owned but couldn't peacefully share? Just as I was beginning to believe the situation might be resolving itself, my phone rang at 3 a.m. It was Mrs. Keller, our elderly neighbor who suffered from insomnia. "Audrey, dear, I thought you should know. There's a realtor's sign in front of your mother's house. It went up after dark." I sat up, fully awake now. "A for sale sign? Are you sure?" "Golden Horizons Realty," Mrs. Keller confirmed. "And there are flyers in a box saying, 'Open House Sunday.' The price seems very low for the neighborhood." A quick internet search confirmed my fears. The house was listed at nearly $50,000 below market value, priced for a quick sale. Despite the court order preventing any sale without my consent, my mother had somehow found a realtor willing to list the property. I called Brian's emergency line, then drove to the house at dawn. The sign was exactly as Mrs. Keller had described, with "motivated seller" emblazoned across the top. Through the windows, I could see the interior had been staged, furniture rearranged, fresh flowers on tables, the hallway freshly painted. My mother's car was in the driveway, but when I knocked, no one answered. Brian arrived an hour later, documenting the unauthorized listing with photographs. "This is a clear violation of the court order," he said grimly. "We'll file for contempt this morning." As we stood discussing next steps, a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway. A middle-aged couple emerged, looking confused at our presence. "Are you the realtor?" the woman asked hopefully. "The listing said we could view any time today." "There's been a mistake," Brian explained smoothly. "This property is not legally for sale. May I ask who scheduled this showing?" "A Mr. Hammond," the man replied, checking his phone. "Said he was handling the listing for a quick cash sale, willing to accept offers today." Walter had returned and was now attempting to sell a house he had no legal right to before disappearing again with the proceeds. While Brian stayed to explain the situation to the disappointed buyers, I used my old key, which still worked on the back door. Apparently my mother hadn't changed all the locks, to enter the house. The interior was immaculate, staged for showing, but something felt off. Many family photos had been removed, and boxes were stacked in the garage, labeled for storage. As I moved through the house, I heard voices from the master bedroom, my mother's and a man's. Walter had indeed returned. I froze, unsure whether to confront them or retreat, when their words became clear. "The Mitchell woman who showed up, she says she's the daughter," Walter was saying, "claims the house isn't legally for sale." "She's bluffing," my mother replied. "We'll be gone before she can do anything. The Rivera family is ready to make a cash offer." "And you're sure your name is the only one on the deed?" Walter pressed. "Richard left everything to me," my mother lied smoothly. "Audrey's just trying to extort money. Once we sell, we'll be in Arizona before she can file any paperwork." Their casual conspiracy to defraud me of my inheritance sent ice through my veins. This wasn't just my mother being manipulated by Walter, she was an active, willing participant in the scheme to steal from me. I retreated quietly and called Brian from the driveway, explaining what I'd overheard. He advised me to stay put. The real estate agent was on her way after being contacted by the would-be buyers, and we needed to ensure she understood the legal situation. Within the hour, an elegant woman in a red blazer arrived, looking increasingly concerned as Brian explained that the property was under litigation and could not legally be sold without both owners' consent. "Mr. Hammond assured me the title was clear," she said, producing paperwork that appeared to show my mother as sole owner, paperwork that had clearly been falsified. As we were speaking, my mother emerged from the house, her expression shifting from confidence to shock when she saw me. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "You're trespassing." "I'm a legal co-owner, Mom. I can't trespass on my own property." "This is my house," she insisted, voice rising. "Your father left it to me." "Mrs. Mitchell," the realtor interrupted, "I'm going to need to suspend this listing until ownership can be verified. My agency can't be involved in a disputed property sale." My mother's face contorted with fury. "There is no dispute. She's lying to you." Walter appeared behind her, all smooth charm. "There seems to be a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could discuss this privately?" "The only misunderstanding," Brian said firmly, "is your client's belief that she can sell jointly owned property without her co-owner's consent. That's not just against the court order, it's fraud." Potential buyers continued arriving throughout the morning, each being turned away by the increasingly uncomfortable realtor. My mother's public meltdown escalated with each disappointed face, her accusations becoming more outlandish. "You've been trying to steal from me since your father died," she shouted as neighbors began to peek from windows. "You never loved him, you just wanted his money." Walter tried to guide her back into the house, but she shook him off. "You want to know the truth?" she spat, face inches from mine. "Your father never loved you. You were an accident we never wanted. The only reason he included you in anything was guilt." The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to strike at my deepest insecurities. Part of me knew they couldn't be true. I had decades of memories proving my father's love, plus his own written words. But hearing my mother voice my worst fears was devastating nonetheless. "Everything he left you was because I insisted," she continued, her voice dripping with venom. "I was the one who made him set up your college fund. I was the one who pushed him to help with your down payment. He would have let you struggle." Walter finally succeeded in pulling her toward the house, but she broke away for one final blow. "All those things of his you've been asking about, the watch, the photos, I destroyed them. Every last reminder of him. He abandoned me with his heart attack. just like you abandoned me for your precious career. The revelation that she had deliberately destroyed my father's possessions, items of no real financial value but priceless sentimental worth, broke something inside me. This wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about erasing my father's memory, punishing me for being his daughter. In the aftermath of this public spectacle, I fled to a local cafe, trembling so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. The barista kept giving me concerned looks as tears streamed down my face unchecked. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Jessica, Brian, and even neighbors who had witnessed the scene, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. For the first time since this ordeal began, I seriously considered walking away not just from the house, but from the entire situation. My architectural firm had offices in Seattle. I could request a transfer, start fresh somewhere. My mother couldn't reach me. The thought of continuing to fight, of facing her hatred in courtrooms and driveways, was exhausting beyond measure. I was so absorbed in my misery that I didn't notice the woman who sat down across from me until she spoke. "You look just like your father when you're thinking hard." I looked up to see Aunt Grace, my mother's older sister, who had moved to Florida years ago. We hadn't spoken since my father's funeral. "Aunt Grace, what are you doing here?" "Rachel called me. Said things had gotten ugly between you and Linda. I caught the first flight I could." Unlike my mother's pinched features and perpetual frown, Grace had laugh lines around her eyes and a warmth that had always made her my favorite aunt. She'd been the only one who sent me birthday cards with actual letters inside, checking in on my life despite the distance. "I should have come sooner," she said, stirring her tea. "When Richard died, I worried about you both, but Linda insisted everything was fine." Over the next hour, Grace filled in pieces of the puzzle I'd never understood: my mother's deep-seated jealousy issues stemming from their own childhood, her resentment of my father's close relationship with me, her history of manipulating situations to cast herself as the victim. "She was always like this," Grace explained sadly. "Always convinced she deserved more, that others were getting advantages she was denied. When you were born, I hoped motherhood might soften those edges, but instead, she saw me as competition," I finished quietly. Grace nodded. "For Richard's attention, his affection, his resources. It wasn't healthy, but he managed it so carefully that you were protected from the worst of it. He absolutely adored you, Audrey. Never doubt that for a second." Her confirmation was a balm to the wounds my mother's words had inflicted. Grace reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Whatever you decide to do about the house, fight or walk away, know that you have family who see the truth. You're not alone in this." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope that something might be salvaged from this wreckage. Not the relationship with my mother, perhaps, but connections to the extended family I had thought lost to me. The aftermath of my mother's public meltdown and attempted fraudulent sale accelerated the legal proceedings. The court ordered mandatory mediation, a last attempt to resolve the property dispute before a forced sale would be implemented. The mediation took place in a sterile conference room downtown, with my mother and me at opposite ends of a long table. Walter was noticeably absent, having reportedly left town on business after the open house debacle. My mother looked smaller somehow, her makeup not quite concealing the shadows under her eyes. The mediator, a retired judge named Howard Benson, reviewed the facts of our case with methodical precision. The evidence of my co-ownership was irrefutable. The documentation of my financial contributions to the property was extensive. My mother's attempts to sell without my consent were clearly documented. "Mrs. Mitchell," Judge Benson said gently after reviewing the paperwork, "I must advise you that your legal position here is not strong. The court will almost certainly order either a buyout or a forced sale with proceeds divided according to ownership percentage and contribution." My mother sat stiffly, eyes fixed on the table. "She's trying to erase me from my own life," she said, her voice barely audible. "First, she took Richard's attention, now she wants the home we built together." The mediator glanced at me, then back at my mother. "Miss Mitchell has offered several compromise solutions, including allowing you to remain in the home for a defined period before sale, or a structured buyout of her interest. These seem like good faith efforts to me." My mother's attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with her case, leaned over to whisper something. She shook her head sharply. "I want her completely out of my life," she stated flatly. No ongoing connections. No arrangements. If the house must be sold, then so be it. The mediator nodded, making notes. And what about the personal property items in dispute? The family photographs and heirlooms? A flash of something guilt? Defiance? Crossed my mother's face. Most of those items were damaged in storage. There's nothing left to return. It was a lie. I had seen several of my father's possessions still in the house during the aborted open house, his collection of architectural models, the antique drafting tools he'd inherited from his own father, photo albums I'd assembled through my childhood. But challenging her now would only escalate tensions further. As the mediation concluded without resolution, Brian pulled me aside. The forgery on those real estate documents is a serious matter, he said quietly. We have clear evidence she attempted to sell property that wasn't solely hers to sell. That's fraud. Are you suggesting pressing criminal charges? I asked, the thought making my stomach twist. It would strengthen our civil case considerably, he acknowledged. And frankly, it might be warranted. This wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attempt to defraud you of your inheritance. I thought of my mother's diminished appearance, the whispers about Walter's emotional manipulation, the possibility that she was as much victim as perpetrator in this situation. Let's focus on the civil case, I decided. I want what's legally mine, but I don't want my mother facing criminal charges. Brian nodded, though I could tell he thought I was being too soft. Perhaps I was. But despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to be the one who sent my mother to jail no matter how much she might deserve it. The day after mediation, I received an unexpected visit at work from Detective Marcus Wilson of the Financial Crimes Unit. He had been investigating Walter Hammond for months in connection with similar schemes in 3 states. We've been building a case against Hammond for elder financial abuse and fraud, he explained. Your mother isn't his first victim, but she might be the one who helps us finally put him away. The detective shared information that confirmed our suspicions. Walter had a documented pattern of inserting himself into the lives of recently widowed women, isolating them from family, then persuading them to liquidate assets before disappearing with the proceeds. In 2 previous cases, the victims had lost their homes and savings. One had been left with such significant debt that she'd been forced to declare bankruptcy at age 72. We need your mother's cooperation to make the strongest case, Detective Wilson said, but so far she's refusing to speak with us. She insists Mr. Hammond is on legitimate business and will return soon. She's in denial, I said, remembering her determined defense of Walter despite mounting evidence of his true nature. She can't admit she's been conned without also admitting she turned against her own daughter for a fraud. Unfortunately, that's a common reaction, the detective sighed. Pride makes people vulnerable to continued exploitation. If you have any information that might help her see the truth. I promised to share anything relevant, though I doubted my mother would listen to anything coming from me. Aunt Grace had been trying to reach her for days without success. My mother had apparently retreated into isolation, not even attending her regular book club or volunteering shifts at the library. 2 days later, Jessica called me at work, her voice urgent. You need to come to the house. There's water pouring out from under the garage door. I arrived to find a disaster. A pipe had burst in the upstairs bathroom, sending water cascading through the ceiling, down the walls, and into the garage. The hardwood floors my father had lovingly installed were buckling. Family photographs that had hung in the hallway lay in sodden piles. The smell of mold had already begun to permeate the air. I've been calling your mother since I noticed it this morning, Jessica explained. She's not answering. Her car's gone. As legal co-owner, I had every right to enter and address the emergency. The locksmith I called confirmed this after seeing my identification and property documents, then helped me gain entry through the front door. The interior was worse than I'd imagined. Water had been flowing for what appeared to be days, causing significant structural damage. Family possessions lay ruined throughout the house. Most heartbreaking were my father's architectural drawings, intricate designs he'd created over decades, now bleeding ink onto the sodden carpet of his former office. I called emergency restoration services, who arrived within the hour to begin water extraction and damage assessment. The lead technician's expression was grim. This is extensive, he said, marking affected areas on a clipboard diagram. You're looking at significant repairs: drywall, flooring, possibly structural elements if the water reached the support beams. Where was my mother during all this? Had she abandoned the house entirely? Left town with Walter? The neighbors hadn't seen her in days. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Even her sister couldn't locate her. As I supervised the emergency repairs over the next several days, taking time off work and sleeping on Jessica's couch, I couldn't shake the worry beneath my anger. For all her flaws and cruelty, my mother was still my mother. The thought of her alone and vulnerable, possibly still under Walter's influence, was troubling. On the third day of restoration work, my phone rang with an unknown number. Audrey? My mother's voice sounded strange, hesitant, almost frightened. I need help. The call lasted less than a minute. She wouldn't say where she was or what had happened, only that she needed me to come to Memorial Hospital. Then she hung up. I found her in the emergency department, being treated for a sprained wrist and facial bruising. She wouldn't meet my eyes as the doctor explained she had fallen downstairs. The defensive wounds on her arms told a different story. Walter? I asked simply when the doctor left. She gave a barely perceptible nod. Where is he now? Gone. Her voice was flat, emotionless. He took everything. The emergency credit card, my mother's jewelry, even my car. Mom, I said gently, you need to file a police report. For once, she didn't argue. She seemed hollowed out, depleted of the fight that had defined her for as long as I could remember. When Detective Wilson arrived to take her statement, she answered his questions mechanically. Confirming what we had suspected, Walter had become increasingly controlling and eventually violent when she questioned his financial decisions. He said if I didn't sign the papers for the house, he'd make me sorry, she said tonelessly. When I finally refused, she gestured to her injuries, then fell silent. As much as I wanted to feel vindicated to say I told you so, the sight of my proud, difficult mother reduced to this broken state brought only a complicated sadness. The victory was hollow, tainted by the knowledge that we had both lost something precious that might never be recovered. Walter Hammond's arrest made the local news 3 days after my mother's emergency room visit. He was detained at Detroit Metropolitan Airport trying to board a flight to Cancun using a stolen credit card. When police searched his belongings, they found jewelry belonging to my mother and 2 other women, along with fraudulent identification documents. The charges were substantial: fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, and assault. Detective Wilson informed us that with my mother's testimony, Walter would likely face significant prison time. 3 previous victims had already come forward after seeing his mugshot on the news. He won't be able to hurt anyone else for a long time, the detective assured us. My mother watched the news coverage in silence from her hospital bed, where she remained for observation due to concerns about her blood pressure and overall health. She had barely spoken since giving her statement, responding to questions with monosyllables or not at all. The neurologist who examined her explained that while there was no physical brain injury, she was exhibiting signs of psychological trauma and possible depression. This combination of betrayal, physical abuse, and financial exploitation can be devastating, especially for someone her age, he explained. She needs time and probably therapy to process what's happened. Meanwhile, the water damage to the house had revealed even more problems. Mold behind walls, electrical issues that posed safety hazards, foundation concerns that had been hidden by hasty cosmetic repairs. The insurance adjuster estimated repairs would cost upwards of $80,000, money neither my mother nor I had readily available. The policy will cover some of it, he explained, but there's evidence of long-term neglect that predates the water damage. That won't be covered. The house that had been at the center of our battle was rapidly becoming a liability rather than an asset. The court-appointed property assessor confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The cost of bringing the house back to marketable condition might exceed its value in the current market. As I stood in what remained of my father's office, salvaging what I could of his drawings and models, I received an unexpected phone call. Audrey? It's your mother. It was the first time she had initiated contact since her hospitalization. Her voice sounded small, uncertain. The doctor says I can be discharged tomorrow. I don't have anywhere to go. The house isn't habitable, and I can't afford a hotel for long. She paused, and I could hear how much the next words cost her. I need your help. It wasn't quite an apology, not even close to the accountability I deserved. But it was an acknowledgement of need, a crack in the wall of hostility she had built between us. And oddly enough, it was the most honest she had been with me in years. "I'll figure something out," I promised, surprised at my own willingness to help after everything she had done. Jessica offered her spare room temporarily, but the awkwardness of that arrangement was obvious to everyone. Aunt Grace suggested my mother come stay with her in Florida, but the doctors advised against long-distance travel until her health stabilized. Eventually, I found a modest month-to-month rental apartment near my own building close enough to check on her, but with enough separation to maintain boundaries. The day I drove her from the hospital to the apartment was tense and quiet. She looked out the window, commenting only once on how different the neighborhood looked since she'd last visited this part of town. As I helped her settle in unpacking the few belongings we'd salvaged from the house, arranging her medications on the kitchen counter, she watched with an expression I couldn't quite read. Finally, as I was preparing to leave, she spoke. "I saw the house. The real estate agent showed me pictures of the damage." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "It can't be saved, can it?" Her voice caught slightly. "Not without spending more than it's worth." "The foundation issues are extensive," I confirmed gently. "The inspector thinks they've been developing for years." She was quiet for a long moment, then said something I never expected to hear. "Your father would be so disappointed in me. He loved that house." It was the closest thing to self-awareness I had heard from her in years. I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded. "The court date is next week?" she asked. "Yes, the judge will make a final ruling on the property division." She surprised me again. "I'm not going to fight it anymore. Tell your lawyer I'll agree to selling the house and splitting whatever we get after repairs. It's what should have happened from the beginning." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but saw only exhaustion and defeat. The fight had gone out of her completely. In its absence, I glimpsed fragments of the mother I remembered from childhood before bitterness had consumed her, before she had hardened into someone unrecognizable. True to her word, at the final court hearing the following week, my mother's attorney informed the judge that she was willing to accept all terms. The house would be sold in its current condition, with proceeds divided equally after accounting for my documented contributions to the property over the years. The judge seemed pleasantly surprised, noting that such reasonable resolution wasn't common in family property disputes. "The court appreciates when parties can find common ground," he remarked, signing the final order. "This is the best outcome for everyone involved." Outside the courtroom, my mother hesitated, then spoke quietly. "I found some things in the bedroom closet that survived the water damage. Photos of you and your father, his watch collection. Some other things you might want." I looked at her in shock, remembering her vicious claim that she had destroyed these items. "You said." "I know what I said," she interrupted, unable to meet my eyes. "I was angry. I didn't. I couldn't actually destroy them. They're in a storage unit on Elm Street." She handed me a key. "The code is your birthday." It was such a small gesture in the face of everything that had happened, yet it felt monumental, the first acknowledgement that perhaps she understood, on some level, the depth of her betrayal. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I received a text message from my mother. "There's a photo album of your graduation in there too. Richard was so proud of you that day." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a reconciliation, but it was something, a tiny opening in a door I had assumed was permanently closed. Whether anything could ever grow through that opening remained to be seen. Selling the house proved to be an unexpectedly emotional process. Despite the water damage and structural issues, interest was high due to the neighborhood's desirability. We accepted a cash offer from a developer who planned to completely renovate the property, essentially rebuilding from the foundation up. Walking through the empty rooms one last time, I traced my fingers along the height markings my father had penciled on the kitchen doorframe. Audrey, age 7, age 10, age 13, all the way up to 18 when I'd left for college. In the master bedroom, I found a small heart my parents had carved into the closet door on their first anniversary, now barely visible beneath layers of paint. Every corner held memories, some painful, but many precious. My mother declined to visit before the closing. "I can't bear to see it like this," she said when I offered to drive her over. "I'd rather remember it how it was when Richard was alive." The proceeds from the sale were divided according to the court order, 50% to each of us, with an additional portion to me from my mother's share to compensate for the years of mortgage payments and improvements I had funded. The amount wasn't life-changing, but it provided a foundation for both of us to move forward. I used my portion for a down payment on a modest townhouse, closer to my office, a place that was entirely mine, with no ghosts or painful history in its walls. The first pieces of furniture I moved in were my father's restored drafting table and his favorite reading chair, saved from the water damage and professionally cleaned. On the wall above the table, I hung his framed architectural license alongside my own, a lineage of creativity and building. My mother, surprisingly, chose not to return to teaching. The district had held her position during her medical leave, but after the public drama of the court case and Walter's arrest, she couldn't face the scrutiny of colleagues and parents. "I'm thinking of moving to be closer to Grace," she told me during one of our now monthly phone calls. These conversations were still awkward, punctuated by long silences and careful avoidance of certain topics, but they were happening, a small miracle in itself. Aunt Grace had become an unexpected bridge between us, gently facilitating communication without forcing reconciliation. "Healing happens on its own timeline," she reminded me when I expressed frustration at my mother's inability to directly acknowledge the pain she had caused. "Some people can never fully admit their mistakes, but they can still change their behavior." Indeed, my mother's actions showed subtle shifts that her words could not express. She no longer made cutting remarks about my career or appearance. She occasionally asked questions about my projects at work, showing interest that seemed genuine if awkward. Once, she even sent a housewarming gift for my new home, a set of architectural prints my father had admired, with a note that simply said, "He would want you to have these." These were not grand gestures of reconciliation. There was no tearful apology, no Hollywood moment of forgiveness and embrace. Instead, there was something quieter and perhaps more honest, a gradual, halting attempt to build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. My extended family relationships slowly healed as well. As the truth about Walter's manipulation emerged through the criminal proceedings, relatives who had shunned me based on my mother's narrative reached out with apologies and attempts to reconnect. Some relationships were permanently altered, trust damaged beyond full repair. Others proved more resilient, strengthening through the honest conversations that followed the conflict. Therapy became an essential part of my healing journey. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped me process not just the recent trauma of betrayal and litigation, but the deeper patterns that had defined my relationship with my mother throughout my life. "You can acknowledge the harm she caused without letting it define you," she advised during one particularly difficult session. "And you can set boundaries without cutting her off completely. There's a middle path." That middle path proved to be the most challenging but ultimately rewarding aspect of the aftermath. Learning to relate to my mother as an imperfect, damaged human being, rather than either the nurturing parent I had craved or the villain who had betrayed me, required constant vigilance and adjustment. "I don't think I can ever fully trust her again," I confessed to Dr. Martinez after a holiday gathering where old tensions had briefly surfaced. "Does that make reconciliation impossible?" "Trust and reconciliation aren't the same thing," she pointed out. "You can have a relationship defined by clear boundaries and limited expectations. The question is whether what remains is valuable enough to preserve." 15 months after the lockout that had upended my life, I hosted a small dinner at my new home. Jessica and her boyfriend were there, along with Tom Collins and his wife, and Aunt Grace, who was visiting from Florida. To everyone's surprise, my mother accepted the invitation. The evening wasn't perfect. Conversation sometimes faltered. My mother grew quiet during discussions of the old neighborhood, but there were also moments of genuine connection, shared memories of my father that brought smiles rather than pain, appreciation for the meal we created together, even a few tentative laughs. As my guests prepared to leave, my mother lingered, looking at the photographs I had arranged on the mantel, many salvaged from the storage unit she had preserved despite her angry claims of destruction. "You have his eyes," she said softly, studying a picture of my father and me fishing at the lake house we had rented each summer. "I always saw so much of him in you, sometimes too much." It was as close to an explanation as she had ever offered for the jealousy and resentment that had poisoned our relationship. Not an excuse, but a glimpse into her perspective that helped me understand the complexity of our shared history. "Thank you for tonight," she said at the door. Your father would be proud of the home you've created." As I watched her drive away, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. I had lost a house but gained clarity. I had experienced betrayal but also discovered strength I hadn't known I possessed. I had learned that standing up for myself didn't require destroying others, that boundaries could be both firm and compassionate. Most importantly, I had honored my father's memory not by clinging to a physical structure, but by embodying the values he had lived by: resilience, integrity, and the courage to build something new when the old foundation proved unsound. The house that had been the center of our conflict was gone now, transformed into something unrecognizable by the new owners. But the home my father had truly wanted for me, a place of security, self-respect, and peace, was finally, on my own terms, becoming a reality. Thank you all for staying with me through this difficult journey. If you've ever had to stand up for yourself against family, I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Remember, sometimes the most important boundaries we set are with the people we love most. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories, and hit that like button if this resonated with you. Your support means everything as we navigate these complex family waters together. Wishing you strength and healing on your own journey.